Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, joined today by one of my favorite guests, Theo Gremminger, one of the greatest Twitter handles in the fantasy football space, the OG Fantasy. Theo, thank you for being here again. I can't imagine there's anyone who doesn't know, but just that's right off the top here. Tell everybody where they can find your stuff, what you've been working on. There you go.
I mean, what haven't I been working on this time of year, Heath? You know, it's like I feel like it's every single day. I love coming on with you. I've had you on Dynasty Life, my Dynasty podcast, a number of times. You were actually one of my very, very first guests. So, yeah, big shout out to everything you're doing over here. But, yeah, you can find almost all of my work over at PlayerProfiler. I do several podcasts over there. I also do the waiver wire column, ton of Dynasty column. And then I write a weekly article in The Athletic that drops on Saturdays. And then I've been doing a podcast with Scott Barrett over at Fantasy Points called School of Scott this season. That's going very well. You can find that over on the Fantasy Points podcast channel. And I do a Dynasty article for them that drops usually Wednesdays or Thursdays, the Dynasty Market Report, where we always talk about players rising and falling in value. And then we always do something sort of cool. Could be trade targets one week. A couple weeks ago, I took a look at like a bird's eye view of the 2025 class and a couple of Dynasty Theory articles as well. So, yeah, I'm all over the place, Heath, but I'm happy to be here today. Really excited. Week 11. We were talking about it in the pre-show. It's like winding down. This is like the money weeks right now.
And, you know, like you said, it's always such a good time when we get to talk to each other. We've got a full show today, but we had a little bit of, I don't know if you'd call it breaking news right before we came on air. So I'm going off script for just a second here, but Isaiah Pacheco's practice window has been opened. And this could have enormous ramifications for all fantasy football leagues down the stretch. We've seen Kareem Hunt be a true workhorse running back, 20 touches almost every single week, producing like a high-end number 2 running back. And we didn't really know with the broken leg, like how long until Isaiah Pacheco comes back, how long until he's actually 100%. We still don't know completely the answer to those questions. But I just wonder, Theo, like if you're a dynasty manager with Isaiah Pacheco, are you thinking, you know what, this might be opening up a sell window. I could sell him to a contender. We don't know if he'll be any good the rest of the year. He doesn't have a lot of draft capital invested in him. We don't know what his future is beyond this year. Are you selling Isaiah Pacheco off this news that the practice window has been reopened?
Well, I actually sold some Pacheco when he got injured. So I think that him coming back stylistically for the Chiefs is a great thing. But Kareem Hunt has averaged 16.8 points per game. Pacheco averaged 16 points per game. And I think at the very least, Kareem Hunt has carved out sort of a, maybe call it a committee backfield if Pacheco is fully healthy. So both of these players are going to cannibalize one another if Pacheco's fully healthy. And then Heath, there's sort of the nightmare scenario that Kareem Hunt, and I know some of the metrics people, some of the analytical people don't love Kareem Hunt right now,
right?
But there is a chance that Kareem Hunt sees the larger share of a two-man committee. And Pacheco, you sort of nailed it. He was never a guy who had exceptional dynasty trade equity and all those sort of things because 7th round pick. And he's also a bit older than you'd like to see for a player with this short a career. So Pacheco to me is a sell. If you have someone in your league thinking that he's going to be like a league winner for them down the stretch and he's going to give them that 16 points a game that he had before he got injured, then absolutely I think I'd consider taking a trade, even a pivot trade to like an older back that I think has a little more value down the stretch is something I'd looked into doing.
I want to give Dan a shout out here, patiently waiting for the best show on CBS. I think it's the best show this week on CBS because you're here, Theo. We are doing something new, at least for this show today. We're actually broadcasting on Twitter. So if you're watching on Twitter, thank you for doing that. If you'd like to have your chat questions read like Dan just did, though, you need to come on over to YouTube. You need to like, you need to subscribe. That really helps us out. I would appreciate it. On today's show, we are talking about some potential buy lows and what I am calling the 2024 yo-yos. Some guys who have moved up in my rankings, moved down in my rankings, moved back up. They've been all over the place. Kyler Murray, Javonte Williams, Brian Thomas, several more guys. Theo is going to help me kind of understand how we should be valuing these guys. Is it more how we viewed them a month ago or how we viewed them in the last couple of weeks? We always start with 3 questions for our guest, and a guy who's probably a yo-yo now coming back up is Chuba Hubbard. Just a fantastic game in the first game where Jonathan Brooks was off the IR but not even active for the game. Now the team's going into their bye. This is another one of those situations where it could turn into a committee, but my gosh, I don't know what else Chuba Hubbard could do to keep a hold of 15 to 20 touches. He has been awesome. How are you valuing Chuba Hubbard for the rest of this season and beyond? He's now got a long-term contract.
Chuba Hubbard is a player that I actually talked about last week after he re-signed, because I think this is one where there's a lot of mental gymnastics going on with Chuba Hubbard managers, that we're sort of hoping for a blackjack split where Hubbard could parlay this year's success into like a starting job elsewhere and get himself away from Jonathan Brooks and sort of that talent profile. But for me, I'm taking shots on trading for Chuba Hubbard regardless of Jonathan Brooks coming back. I think that he's sort of earned himself at least like I think this is that in an ideal situation, they're sort of stylistically like what Detroit is doing right now with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery next year. Carolina's had a great deal of failure at the quarterback position. So for better or for worse, and I know sort of the like smart NFL contract people sort of hate what they're doing, throwing money at a running back after drafting one so early in the second round. And this is compounded after they had a bust with signing Miles Sanders, and that sort of didn't work out nearly like they thought it would. So they put a lot of emphasis into the running back position. To me, Chuba Hubbard is going to provide me dynasty running back utility. And Heath, I know a lot of the teams that we build are wide receiver heavy, tight end heavy, guys that are assets that will last a long time, especially in startups. You don't want to put that early pick into a running back because the shelf life can be short. But with Hubbard, it's a guy that I've seen perform very well this year. And if it was, this is a team that averages like 16 points per game. If Carolina was middle of the pack in terms of points per game, Chuba Hubbard would be like a top 5 running back right now. So Hubbard is a guy that showed that he can play on an NFL field. He now has a top 10 contract. I think that this is like people expecting him to completely fade away are kidding themselves. I want to take shots on Hubbard. This is a great time to buy. People are expecting Hubbard to regress when Brooks steps on the field, and you have Carolina on a bye week. So it's a sort of a perfect opportunity to kick the tires on an offer to the Hubbard manager. And I think, like, unlike a lot of the guys we talk about, Heath, Hubbard's a guy who's going to be very manager specific when you're trying to value him out. I think some managers are going to be like, man, I really wish I would have sold. And some managers are like, no, forget it. I'm not accepting your buy low. I'm not even going to counter this one. But I would send an offer over and see if I couldn't pick up a running back who's playing fantastic this year.
Speaking of sending an offer over, who's your favorite vet to buy for a contending team right now?
So I have 2 of them, and they're both old guys, which is fun. I love this time of year. It's like the annual tradition of contending teams buying old guys who are going to play well in the fantasy playoffs. But I think for me, the high level play of Baker Mayfield and also just what we've seen out of Liam Cohen, the offensive coordinator, makes me really trust the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. We saw them nearly beat Kansas City in that overtime loss. And it's been like production from Cade Otton, productions from multiple running backs. But now when Mike Evans returns, there will be no Chris Godwin. And their schedule over the next few weeks is really, really strong. They have that Carolina Panthers team twice. They play the Las Vegas Raiders. Mike Evans is a player that I think can have a major impact in the fantasy football playoffs. And I think that we just simply need to look back to last year to what Mike Evans looked like in terms of his scoring numbers when he was the overwhelmingly preferred target of Baker Mayfield. So I'm kicking the tires on Mike Evans. There's a lot of Mike Evans teams out there that are not contenders, and they are going to have to get rid of them this time of year because of the age and all that sort of thing. And then running back wise, I'm looking to trade for James Conner whenever possible. This is a 29-year-old, so you're always going to pay a slight discount, but this is sort of one of the most impressive seasons he's ever had in his career. He's running back 9 overall. And Heath, you could argue that Conner is kind of unlucky to only be RB9. You had like the fluky week 9 game where 3 Arizona Cardinals had rushing touchdowns, and none were to James Conner. He's incredibly elusive this year. He leads the league in forced missed tackles. And then when we talk about fantasy playoff schedules, you've got the New England Patriots, you've got the Carolina Panthers, and you've got the LA Rams on the road. Arizona is also in the running for an NFC playoff berth. So they're going to be playing for everything down the stretch. And it's hard to trust Connor because he never plays a full season. But hey, Heath, this is the year of the running back, and this is the year of the old running back. And I think James Conner is a guy I would trust down the stretch. And then the final guy I'll throw out there, just because not a veteran, but I'm going to kick the tires on a Tyrone Tracy offer, because this is another one where people are kind of pulling their hair out. He looks incredible, but there's going to be people who have been burned over the years by like a James Robinson situation, a Tyler Algier situation. You've seen it time and time again where you have a low draft capital running back gain dynasty value and then just get sort of obliterated during the NFL draft. I don't think that's the case with Tracy. I think Tracy is a keeper. I think this is a player that the Giants are going to go into 2025 excited about. But the dynasty manager rostering him might be worried about the outlier profile, the fact that he's like 25 years old. But I think he's just awesome.
So a few thoughts here. First, I needed to go back and clip Theo talking about James Conner, because I need to sell James Conner in 2 different leagues in the next week. And I'm just going to be sending this out to the contending managers in that league. Second, you mentioned this schedule coming up for Conner. I just want to, like, Mike Evans is my favorite buy for a couple of reasons, but largely because as soon as this bye week's over, the Giants, the Panthers, the Raiders, the Chargers, the Cowboys, the Panthers again. And what does Mike Evans really care about? He really cares about continuing that 1,000-yard streak, and he's way behind pace now. He may average 100 yards per game coming off his bye. I love the talk on Conner. I think that with Tracy, I've kind of become convinced that what really matters for these low-cost running backs that perform well is, does the coach stick around? Because the guys that we've seen perform well and then kind of stick have had the same head coach. Does Brian Dable stick in New York? I think that's very questionable, TBD. But Tracy could be the type of back who's worth it just based on what he does over the next 6 weeks. And you have the bonus, he might be a must-start running back next year. Let's go completely the opposite direction now. I asked about vets. I want to ask about rookies. There's been a lot of movement at the top. And last week I was on Beyond the Box Score with Dan Schneier and Jacob Gibbs, and they asked me to kind of redo my Superflex rookie rankings. I think it's almost more difficult, though, in a 1-quarterback league. So I want to know, Theo, if you had to make your top 5 2024 rookies in a 1 QB league, who are they?
Malik Neighbors at the top quite easily. Not even worth the discussion. Number 2, the non-tight end premium managers might argue this is not the move, but Brock Bowers is number 2 for me, and easily number 2. What he's been able to do at the tight end position at 21 years old, challenging for tight end 1 overall numbers, and just the amount of catches he's going to end up with at the end of the year historically as a rookie, surefire number 2. Marvin Harrison Jr., number 3 still. We wish there was more consistency, but it's not like Harrison Jr. is without talent. This is not a guy who's going to be some massive bust. I think we should have had maybe lower expectations heading into the year, but it's not Harrison Jr.'s fault that we were drafting him at like the 1-2 turn at the beginning of September. Number 4, Brian Thomas Jr., who's been a little shaky of late, but he's dealing with a chest injury. But in terms of showing us what he's capable of as a pro, he has 3 games over 20 points scored. Looks like a young Josh Gordon, that type of outside alpha wide receiver. And I think there'll be a great deal of enthusiasm for him heading into next season in redraft and in Dynasty. And number 5, this was difficult. I think it's Odunze. I think it's still Rome Odunze. This is sort of a lost season for him with all the problems that Chicago has on offense. But I think with the talent profile that we liked coming into the draft and the expectation that things are going to get better in Chicago when you have coaching changes this offseason. Certainly we'll see a new offensive coordinator this week. It's still a Doomsday at 5, and then a couple guys honorable mention, but I think that's right about where I'm at with this class right now.
Awesome stuff. Will says in the chat, I sold Connor for Bucky and Ladd. Great job, Will. I hope everybody in my league still listening. That's what it's going to take to get James Conner off my roster. Give me a couple of borderline top 12 rookies. Fantastic job. Again, we will try to get to a few more of your questions from the chat as the show goes on. If you're watching on Twitter, thank you for watching there. If you want to have your questions answered, come on over to YouTube, ask the questions in the chat. We'll take our first break. We'll be right back with our 2024 yo-yos. So again, this is not exactly a brilliant concept. Yo-yos go down, they come back up if you're any good at it. There have been some players that even in my Dynasty rankings, because I do try to update those every week, they've moved. They're not, it's not all moving the same direction. They go up one week, they go down the next week. I don't really know what to make of them. And at quarterback, there's a couple of them. Kyler Murray coming off maybe his best game of the season. He says he's playing quarterback the best he's ever played. He's seeing the field better than he's ever played. He knows the offense better than he ever has. But it hasn't always translated to fantasy production. This even Drew Petzig, I've kind of been a yo-yo with him as to whether I think he's doing a good job or not. As of right now, I have Kyler Murray ranked as my QB 8 in Dynasty. He is ahead still of Caleb Williams. He's ahead for me of Jordan Love, Drake May, Justin Herbert, right behind Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud. But I don't ever know which direction he's going to move next. Where are you at on Kyler Murray, Theo?
Yeah, I think he's in that range where one week you want to rank him QB8, and then another week you're angry and you want to push him down to QB12. I would go Drake May over Kyler Murray if that offer was extended to me, because I don't have to deal with the previous injuries. And with Drake May, I think it's all upside from here. Kyler Murray has good weapons this year. To have Harrison Jr., to have Trey McBride, to have a healthy James Conner. I mean, Kyler's doing what Kyler does. It's like, even with the lack of, I'd say consistent high-end production, he's still QB7 on the year. So it's like, at the end of the day, you can't really dock him that much, because the end of the year, he's still going to be a mid QB1 with like a low-end QB1 is like the downside. So I think you're fine ranking him there. I would probably have him slightly lower. I'm going to go Jordan Love over him in Dynasty. I'm going to go Drake May over him in Dynasty, head-to-head at trade offer. But it's all in the same wheelhouse, Heath.
The other guy at quarterback I had was Russell Wilson. And full disclosure, I was very optimistic about Russell Wilson this offseason. I thought last year was almost entirely Sean Payton's problem. And I thought that we really kind of overlooked that Russ was still fine for fantasy last year, even when he looked bad. Well, then he had the calf injury and the Steelers were winning. And I got a little bit concerned, is Russell Wilson ever going to get a chance to start again? They started him despite their record. He's been fantastic, and CBS scoring currently QB6 per game. Now he gets to face the pass funnel Baltimore Ravens. He may be a top 5 quarterback by the time we talk next week. I wonder, Theo, has he done enough to where you trust him as a starter this year? And has he done enough to where maybe this isn't the last year of Russell Wilson's fantasy production?
Okay, I'll give you a little sidebar. I'm going to give you a shout out, some props, Heath. This past offseason, you talked up Russell Wilson. You also talked up James Cook. So you get some props here, Heath. Those were very, very good calls. I think with Russell Wilson, I think you sort of nailed it. The guy's 3-0, and the play has been incredible. He has 7 combined touchdowns, only 1 interception, and 3-0 is the operative word here. I think Pittsburgh needs to be discussed as a dark horse Super Bowl contender out of the AFC if this continues, because they have talent on both sides of the ball. Kansas City sort of leaves a lot of question marks, even though they have a unbelievable record. Every game is sort of like you're not feeling great about things. Tampa Bay, Denver, they sort of just get by the skin of their teeth, and they're incredibly well coached. Obviously, Patrick Mahomes, and obviously they're the Super Bowl champions. But Baltimore is a team that we were really excited about for weeks, and now they are giving up points to everyone. Pittsburgh, I think if they get it going, they can make a deep run. And I think if you see the Pittsburgh Steelers make a deep run in the AFC playoffs, I think that they're going to go back to Russell Wilson next year. And I think Russell Wilson will actually box at Pittsburgh out from having access to one of these quarterbacks in what's not really the deepest class. So the 2025 quarterback class, if you speak to some draft experts, there might be 2 quarterbacks drafted in the first round. There might be 4, but there's not going to be like some excessive number. So I think Pittsburgh boxes themselves out of a top prospect, and I think they go with Russell Wilson again next year. So Russell Wilson, I think that's a guy who's actually pretty steady right now as long as they keep winning.
So you were really kind to give me some flowers, and now I'm going to curse what I said about Javonte Williams all off season. You know, it's been such a strange ride. We spent the summer hearing, you know, he might lose his job, and then he's the clear RB1, and then it's a 3-headed monster, and then he's the clear RB1, and he scored like 30 fantasy points against the Saints about a month ago, and he had 1 rush attempt in their most recent game as Audric Estime took over the early downs, and Williams barely played. This might be a short one. Is it over?
I think it's over. I think that he had the New Orleans game, and I think that the New Orleans game was sort of like, that should have been the automatic sell window for everyone. Instead, it gave the managers rostering him hope that this is going to be it for the rest of the season. So Javonte Williams is a guy that you weren't the only one. I think people were really excited about a potential bounce back. There were some very, let's say, sharp people in fantasy this year on Javonte Williams as a value as we got towards the end of the summer. And dynasty managers that were still rostering him were the real believers, because you've had multiple windows to sell him over the years. And this has been a guy that's obviously dealt with injuries, been a very frustrating asset. During his rookie season, Heath, this guy looked like he was going to be an absolute star for us.
Right.
So I think it's over. I think it's Audric Estime for the rest of the year. Estime doesn't have the receiving upside of a Javonte Williams, but one thing Audric Estime can do is he can absorb volume as a runner. And I think that's what Sean Payton wants. I think Sean Payton wants a workhorse running back who can churn out rushing yardage. And with Bo Nix's, scrambling ability and his mobility at the quarterback position, I think that is going to simplify the offense. And I think with that strong defense, that's exactly what Denver wants. I think it's going to be Audric Estime rest of the season. Javonte Williams is going to have some games where he catches some passes, but it's going to be very difficult for you to predict which games he can use them.
Christian from the chat says Javonte needs out of Denver still talent, but it's a weird situation. You know, I'm probably holding Javonte at least until I see what free agency says about him this coming off season, but I'm not optimistic. I do think maybe if he got an opportunity in the right spot, he could still be okay. Let's talk about a guy who did bounce back. Tony Pollard has had some serious run as a true feature back, has outproduced his ADP. His dynasty stock has risen. But the most recent game, Tyjae Spears comes back, and it kind of looked more like the 50-50 split they said it was going to be all year. And you look back at the last game that Spears played before he got hurt, and it kind of looks like the 50-50 split they said it was going to be all year. Has Tony Pollard been propped up by the fact that Spears was injured, and so he got a bunch of extra volume, but now we're going to see a true timeshare in a truly bad offense?
I think that's the downside risk. I think it's a little bit more of a 65-35 type split than maybe the 50-50. Pollard still had more than double of the rushing attempts, and it's not like Spears came in and was targeted a bunch of times in the passing game. I think that would be the fear, is that Pollard loses those valuable targets. Pollard's solid. He's just not like, when Spears was out, there were people saying that Pollard can maybe give us RB1 production for the rest of the season. That's not it, but he's still a locked-in RB2. He's still giving you utility. And in terms of his dynasty stock, he's got the contract insulation. He'll be in Tennessee next year. We anticipate that this offense should get better in year 2. I don't think Callahan is some like dumb guy in terms of running an offense. I think that this is like growing pains, quarterback issues, new offensive linemen. And I think year 2 in Tennessee, there should be a little bit more of a semblance of like consistency, and Pollard will be there again next year. So he certainly has stabilized his dynasty stock. And the most important thing is he's completely healthy. That tightrope surgery last year really held him back. And we don't have to worry about that at all in terms of next year. So I think Pollard is sort of a steady dynasty asset, but not one that's going to like win you leagues this year.
Well, that was kind of my next question. I think for two things. One, I think, and it's not the same exact thing, but Pollard should probably be a cautionary tale for someone who thinks that Isaiah Pacheco is going to come back and be a league winner in the fantasy playoffs this year. He may not be 100% healthy even when he's active and playing. Two, Pollard's upcoming schedule is pretty miserable. But then we get to week 13, and it's Washington, who hasn't had a good run defense. He plays Jacksonville. That should be a competitive game. He's got the Bengals. He's got the Colts. He's got Jacksonville again in fantasy championship. I think if I could be, especially with what you hit on, that like he's going to be a starting running back for the Titans next year, I could talk myself in as a contender to sending a second round pick for Tony Pollard and seeing if that would work.
I did just that. There's a couple leagues where I've sent like a second rounder, picked him up. I don't think you want to go heavier than that.
No,
but I think your downside risk with that sort of a trade, it's a fine one. You could even add on sort of just a body at running back as well, maybe a fifth rounder on top just to get the deal done. But I think that's fine. I think you just don't want to overpay for him. But again, having these guys who give you that sort of utility, Heath, and we don't know if Spears will break down again. So if Spears misses time, those like great matchups in the fantasy playoffs could be all Pollard's again. So yeah, I'm with you. I think Pollard's fine. He's just a kind of like, we have to be realistic about where he's at.
I've got a couple of wide receiver yo-yos, and they have so much in common. You might just like Brian Thomas Jr., currently on Jacksonville. Calvin Ridley was on Jacksonville last year. Both of these guys may be dealing with awful quarterback play for the remainder of this season. Both of them better as downfield wide receivers, elite upside on a weekly basis, almost no floor. Now, obviously, Ridley's a vet towards the end of his fantasy production. Brian Thomas Jr. just getting started. But again, bounced all over my rankings. I was encouraged by what we saw from Ridley last week. I'm terrified of what we're going to get from Thomas the rest of the season. But let's start with Thomas. Is there any concern at all other than the fact that he's maybe playing with Mac Jones for the rest of the year? Like, did we get too far over our skis when we move up into the top 10 wide receivers just almost immediately?
I don't know. I think that where we have him in terms of the dynasty rankings is like a forward-thinking model where the guy was giving us these multiple 20-point games. So he flashed and he showed his sort of fantasy ceiling. And what he was doing was historically strong. Like right. The yardage he was putting up, like we can't ignore that. But I do think that there is a potential rookie wall compounded by the quarterback issues, compounded by he's questionable every week with a chest injury. So the guy's dealing with quarterback issues. The guy's dealing with a slight injury that's at least limited him. And Jacksonville, like you said, is sort of a mess to begin with. So BTJ is a guy that's a really impossible asset for you because you can't trade him. This is a guy where when everything sort of stabilizes, well, I'll take that back. You can't trade him unless you get an elite player that's going to give you elite scoring for the rest of the season. This is not a guy that you're just getting rid of because you want to chase it. You have to be a real contender to move on from Brian Thomas Jr. right now, because I think once we get into dynasty startup season, that value is going to go right back up, Heath, because this is a guy that we know is talented, was a first-round pick. The profile is there to be great for years to come. Ridley, on the other hand, is such a weird one because he has been on fire for the last 3 weeks. 20 points per game over the last 3 weeks. This incredible target share. He has 20 catches over his last 3 games combined, and he's doing this with multiple quarterbacks. So DeAndre Hopkins is not there. He's sort of the only man in town, and they paid him a huge contract. So Ridley, you're starting to see, I think, come on. I'm actually like, I feel gross about saying this because it's always like, I feel like this could come back to bite me. But I think that I'm actually somewhat bullish on Calvin Ridley for the rest of the year. Again, I don't think this is a guy that you'd have to pay a whole lot for. But I think if you're in like a start 3 wide receiver format, I think people are willing to get rid of him for pretty cheap as like a sort of a sell high. and you might be able to get a 15 point per game player for the rest of the season based on this current target share and sort of the willingness that Tennessee has to continue to utilize him at such a high rate.
So are you thinking kind of like with Pollard, a late second is probably what you're offering, maybe throw on a fourth on top if you need to?
Yeah, and I think with Ridley, there's going to be some managers who might take even less in a trade because the scarcity of the running back position is always going to sort of raise these guys in terms of what you have to give up. Wide receiver is sort of a dime a dozen. So a guy like Ridley, some managers who are out of it right now might be looking at him as sort of a diminishing asset that's old, and I just want to get him off my roster and maybe pick up a pick. So you might actually be able to get him for cheaper than Pollard despite the last 3 weeks. So I think he's a really solid target for you to go after.
The Thomas one, you really got me thinking when you mentioned like you should only really deal him if you're a true contender. And with where he was drafted, I think he's definitely on some true contender rosters. The team I was referencing earlier, and it's our Baked Burger Dynasty League. We did a fundraiser last year, raised a bunch of money for St. Jude. We've got some fans in that league. Adam Azer, Dan Schneyer's in that league. Thomas Schaefer's in the league. Jamie's in the league. Dan Schneier actually is a true contender in that league with a kind of a tight end problem. And I've been trying to deal the combination of Romeo Doubs and Travis Kelce to him for a late first, and Dan won't come off of it. I'm wondering if I throw in a James Conner, if instead of getting a late first, I could get a Brian Thomas Jr. and Dan gets 3 players that are going to help him win a championship. And instead of getting the 10th or 11th or 12th pick in the draft next year, I get Brian Thomas Jr., who might be worth a top 5 pick.
I mean, I think if you can pull off that trade, I think that's a slam dunk for you to get a first rounder and to get Brian Thomas for 2 guys who.
No, I'm talking about no first rounder, just Brian Thomas.
I would do that. I would make that trade. I would take to move off of Kelce, move off of Doubs, and potentially a Connor. If you're not in the win now window, Connor is the guy that you should be looking to move off of. 29 years old,
right.
Father Time's undefeated, and he's got a Trey Benson problem heading into next year. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I think that's a solid way of doing it. And I'll say this, like the contending wide receivers, this is a whole, I mean, we could do a whole hour on this, but like you've got a couple of these contending teams that are holding guys like a CeeDee Lamb. The dynasty theory of potentially having to pivot off of great dynasty assets to go chase the money, chase the trophy is there for dynasty managers right now, with sort of these changing views of these offenses, these quarterback problems. So yeah, the Brian Thomas Jr. one's definitely an interesting one for some of these managers.
Love it. I think we had one. Oh, I said we had one tight end yo-yo. We had 2, but let's just do one because he's been the yo-yo for the last half of a decade almost now. It's Kyle Pitts. Still making plays like an elite athlete, like an elite tight end, like a guy that, man, I could see that guy being tight end 1 for the next 3 years, still having a lot of single-digit fantasy football games. Where are you at on Kyle Pitts? Is he ahead of Dalton Kincaid, I think, is maybe the mesh point in dynasty rankings?
I think you have to put him ahead of Kincaid because of the target competition and the productivity. He's been more productive than Dalton Kincaid. Kincaid is going to have to deal with increased target competition in the next few years, whereas Kyle Pitts, we've already seen him like with now a Mooney, with a Drake London, and also Bijan catching passes. Kyle Pitts is just frustrating this year, but at the end of the day, the guy's still giving you like tight end 7 production, but it's sort of a purgatory value because you don't feel like you're getting like a Bowers or a Kittle type edge from it. Pitts has just been very inconsistent. He had 3 really big games that accounted for over 50% of his production. So you have seen the spike weeks. The issue is there's multiple pass catchers involved in Atlanta. So like the preseason narrative was Kyle Pitts is going to be the number 2 target behind Drake London, and we're going to have this insane year. It's actually been Mooney having a career year and has been performing incredibly well. There's no reason to think that anything's going to change with Mooney next year. If anything, he's going to be stabilized in the offense. Then you've got the Ray McCloud problem, where Ray McCloud actually has very similar target share numbers to Kyle Pitts. So McCloud's not a guy that's in our fantasy lineups, but he's annoying enough a presence in terms of earning targets that he's also been another mouth to feed that sort of like limits Pitts' ceiling. And then you've got Bijan Robinson, who's number 3 among all running backs in receptions this season, and will challenge for running back 1 overall in terms of receptions when the season's over. So Pitts has competition. Pitts is inconsistent, but at the end of the day, as a dynasty manager, he's still sort of in a solid place. It's just frustrating, Heath.
I just want to tell everybody I have made the offer to Dan Schneier. We're going to take a break. I'm going to send Dan a chat, see if we can get him to accept this offer on the air. I offered him Travis Kelce, James Conner, Romeo Doubs, all for Brian Thomas Jr., who he probably can't even start the rest of the year. You should take this deal, Dan, if you're listening. We'll be right back after this break.
Saturdays at 3:30. It's big time. Saturday on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
Dan is not showing as active in Slack, so I'm not sure he's going to respond. That's okay. It'll be fine. He's not going to accept it. Dan is going to leave it sitting there and not answer the trade, and then he's going to put a message out saying that he's looking to deal Brian Thomas Jr. if anybody would give him some vets, and never respond to me, because that's what Dan does. Let's play a quick game of Are These Buy Lows? We talked about Caleb Williams just a little bit at the start of the show. It's hard with these rookie quarterbacks when they look this lost to still believe. But like, it's been 9 football games. We thought he was a generational prospect just a few months ago, and we've seen a lot of rookie quarterbacks be terrible and then turn into great NFL quarterbacks. Is Caleb Williams a buy low?
I don't want to. Well, how low? How low, Heath? You have to quantify that one, because yeah, if you're looking to like completely get out, I'll take him off your hands. But this is not one where I want to like go re-roll it and trade. I'm not gonna pay 80 cents on his offseason price this past offseason. Like, you're not getting a 20% haircut type offer. That's kind of where I'm at on Caleb. I'm a little nervous. The weapons have been there. We can blame the offensive coordinator all we want. We've seen a few strong games, so we know he's not incapable of it. He's had 2 games, I believe, over 300 yards passing. But it's been the consistency. It's been the lack of hitting the first read. It's been just sort of the lack of awareness. And also he's taking sacks, which is not all of his fault, but a little bit of like pocket presence, awareness, like especially when it's compounded by how many Caleb Williams managers, if they could go back today, would take Jaden Daniels. I think all of them. And how many Caleb Williams managers, if they could go back today and take Drake May instead, I think more than half. I am nervous. So I don't know. I already have some Caleb Williams. And I don't know if I'm looking to add right now. But again, if it never say never until I hear the price.
So Will says it's an absolute smash except deal. Dan would be crazy not to take it. I'm trying to figure out how to take a screenshot of this and send it to Dan in Slack. I'm sure that will help, Will. I appreciate your support. So you wouldn't pay 80 cents on the dollar for Caleb Williams. Would you pay 50 cents on the dollar for how we had Anthony Richardson ranked in this previous offseason? The Joe Flacco experiment has not gone well for Indianapolis, but Richardson, it's not like he was unfairly benched. He looked terrible as a quarterback earlier this year. You have any hope for a bounce back from Anthony Richardson?
It's funny because Williams and Richardson are the 2 youngest starters going into the season. And they're the 2 guys who have lost probably, well, in Richardson's case, the most dynasty value. Williams is still pretty insulated, number 1 overall pick, still holding his job. But I do think this is going to change the way certain NFL teams go about their draft process. Richardson was a guy who only started like 13 games for the Florida Gators. This is a guy who needed as many starts as possible, and they're so willing to move on. Doesn't really bode well for me. Am I going to pay 50% on the dollar? Probably, just as a value chase. But I'm looking to avoid trading first-round picks for Anthony Richardson, and that's the sort of deals you're seeing going down, where certain leagues, guys are willing to take a chance and throw first at it. That I don't want to do, but I am willing to take on some Richardson. I do think he gets a second opportunity. How insulated will that role be? like we saw Justin Fields this year get another opportunity and give us a top 6 fantasy production. Certainly Richardson never got anywhere close to where Fields was in terms of fantasy productivity. Obviously, Fields had way, way more opportunities, but another team will give Richardson the opportunity. If not, it's Indianapolis this year because Flacco has just been so poor recently. But the fact that they were willing to go with a almost 40-year-old Joe Flacco over this guy who needs starts, that's a whole nother issue. So, yeah, I'm willing to take on some Richardson, but I don't know. We have to kind of quantify that 50 cents on the dollar, Heath.
Yeah, well, that's the difficult thing to do. But it sounds like at what perceived cost, Anthony Richardson more of a buy low than Caleb Williams. We had a question from the chat that actually is one of our buy lows. Is Xavier Worthy a player I should keep in a dynasty league? Okay, I'll answer that, Joseph. Yes, 100% you should keep him. But I'll ask Theo the question, is he a player you should buy low? This was a guy who went somewhere in that Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey range in most rookie drafts, between picks 7 and 10 generally. Maybe he fell to the 11th pick. I wonder, as a team that's like, I've got a couple of rebuilders we've talked about, maybe going to have the 4th or 5th pick in the draft. If I send a round 2 pick for Xavier Worthy, so I'm buying him 1 round cheaper, would you trade a 2025 second for Worthy if you thought it was a pretty decent second?
I think that's the market right now for Worthy. And it's team context. If I have a team that's a real rebuild and I want to see if maybe his role gets expanded, I think that's a price I'm willing to take. I'm just worried that the Chiefs don't view him as anything more than sort of a Swiss Army knife, very fast player. And at the end of the day, that's not what we thought when they got drafted in the first round. This was their first round pick at the wide receiver spot since 2016. And they attached Patrick Mahomes to a guy that was his fastest wide receiver since Tyreek Hill. And I think we went head over heels. But it's another really, really fast guy in the first round who sort of isn't returning fantasy football value. Now, I think he's got long-term value in the NFL. I mean, Ted Ginn played how many years, Heath?
Right.
But that's what my worry would be, that he ends up being more of a Ted Ginn type. A Mecole Hardman's going to play a very long NFL career as well. So I don't know. I think that the fact that the role didn't greatly expand when Rashee Rice went down is an issue for me. The guy's going to score some touchdowns. It's too good of a scheme, and he's too explosive of a player with the ball in his hands to not give you some touchdowns. But again, I think it's going to be a guy who is rarely in your starting lineup, at least for the foreseeable future. And when he rips off a 60-yard manufactured rush attempt for a touchdown, you're going to be like, great, that doesn't really help me that much right now. So I'm a little cautious about the profile. And then just from a pure, there's always a bust. And there are very few of these guys look like busts in this first round right now. So maybe he's the bust. And it's sad to say that. But I think he's a more valuable commodity as an NFL player than as a fantasy player, if that sort of makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I will let everyone know that Dan has declined the trade. He said, whose willpower? I'm sorry, Will. He didn't mean that. That was rude. And so I think I'm moving on to it's going to be sad when Thomas beats you with these players in the championship part of negotiations. I'm openly threatening to trade the players to someone else so that they can knock Dan out of the championship. We've got 3 more rookies that I want to know, Theo, are they buy lows? Jonathan Brooks, Rome Odunze, Ben Sinnott. Obviously, huge difference in cost between the first 2 and the third one, but just kind of relative to their cost, which of these 3, Brooks, Odunze, and Sinnott, would you be most likely to buy low on?
If I could pick one for my dynasty rosters, it's going to be Rome Odunze. This is a guy with, I think, the profile, the early first round draft capital, and the fact that I think Chicago is going to turn things around eventually with him. Also, the Keenan Allen issue, where Keenan Allen's sort of the annoying presence. Keenan won't be a Bear next year. It's going to be Odunze and probably DJ Moore as the 2 wide receivers in Chicago. I'm willing to kick the tires on Brooks. As bullish as I am about Chuba Hubbard, I'm now able to get a player that I think is very talented in Jonathan Brooks at a discount. And I think that the Chuba Hubbard production and the Rachaad White production last year shows me that multiple backs have thrived in a Dave Canales system. I think that we need to sort of temper our expectations for Brooks. It's going to be a little bit more of a committee next year, but this is a guy that is very good at football, is coming off a major injury. It's long-term, it's probably bodes him well to have not rushed back. I think we'll see him a little bit towards the end of the year. And again, like I said with Hubbard, I think that this is going to be a committee that they lean into. And I'm fine having Brooks on my Dynasty rosters because I believe he is a talented player. And Heath, at the end of the day, Dynasty should be us trying to get as many talented players as possible on our rosters and hoping that a couple of them pop in terms of usage.
Awesome stuff as always, Theo. We've got a couple of minutes for some questions from the chat. Phillips is a Dynasty Chuba Hubbard owner, and if you're just checking into the show, we talked about Chuba Hubbard's value earlier in the show. Would you trade him for Zay Flowers or Jaden Reed? For me, that's a yes in a hurry.
Yes, either one. Absolutely. Both of those guys are top 18 wide receivers in Dynasty now, Heath. I think they're both mid-level wide receiver 2s, and by the end of the year, one of those guys could be a wide receiver 1 in Dynasty. Both have been very impressive.
Christian asks, are we thinking that Estime could be a target for contenders? Maybe get him for a third? I'd be surprised if you could get him for a third right now, Theo. And I'm not sure, unless you're in a non-PPR league, that he's really going to help a championship team. How do you feel about that?
It all depends on your roster construction, Christian. I think I'm there if I've been like piecemealing together RB2 and I want to have more viable bodies for the stretch run. I'm good doing that. Again, I think he's going to be manager specific because the way that you value these day 3 picks, different managers will value them differently. So I think it's worth it. But again, it's team context for you, Christian. Depends on where you're at in your RB2 spot.
Two very interesting players. Thoughts on Nick Chubb trying to flick JMO for a running back? What's the correct value for a player like him? Seems like the definition of a yo-yo player. Both of those guys could be, although Chubb hasn't given us much reason to move him up yet. Would you deal JMO for Chubb if you were looking for a running back, or would you look elsewhere?
I might look elsewhere. I think it's sad to say we'll know a lot more about Nick Chubb after the bye week.
Yeah.
Maybe it was him getting his feet wet and he's going to come back a little bit more acclimated, a little more game ready. But it hasn't been good. And Chubb also has the impending free agency. You have to think maybe Cleveland just moves on. This is a dangerous draft for running backs in sort of Nick Chubb's mold, kind of a diminishing dynasty asset, because this draft class is absolutely loaded at the running back position. So I think Jameson Williams obviously holds more longer-term dynasty value. I mean, look, Jameson Williams has had really strong moments this year and some games where he's completely non-existent, but he's still a very young player. And this is sort of the most consistency we've seen from him in any season. So I think I'm going to lean on the Jameson Williams side in this trade.
We've got 2 questions left. Are Evans and Sutton good cheap buys for a contender? We also talked buying Evans earlier in the show. I'm not sure how cheap he's going to be unless you can get somebody who's not certain that he's going to be 100% the rest of the year. But Courtland Sutton, I think, is an interesting one. We talked about Tony Pollard. We talked about Calvin Ridley, guys that we would trade a second-round pick for. Has Sutton done enough to where you'd be willing as a contender? So it's probably a late second to deal a second for Sutton.
I think I am if I'm in and I think that, again, Sutton's the kind of guy that during these bye weeks is going to help me get that top seed. You have 2 bye weeks where there's 6 teams on bye over the next upcoming weeks. And Sutton's a perfect guy for you to have on your roster. This is clearly the number 1 target in Denver. And yeah, Sutton, every time we forget about him, he scores a touchdown. So I'm okay making that.
And the last one from Parker. What about Dalton Kincaid? When do we hop off the Kincaid train, if at all? And I think as a weekly starter, as soon as you can find somebody you feel better about starting him, you shouldn't feel guilty about that at all. But there is a bigger conversation here. We're talking about a guy who was the 25th pick in the NFL draft, a first-round pick tied to Josh Allen. There were very good reasons that people have been excited about him the last 2 seasons. He's been an enormous disappointment to me, just in terms of what he's done with this opportunity, because he did get the opportunity this year and he's just not done very much with it. Now he's kind of banged up. Are you still holding out hope that Dalton Kincaid can reach the heights that we had hoped for from him, or is he just going to be that low end tight end one?
I think that's more likely what he is I think he's a mid to low end tight end 1 with insulation. He'll be there for a long time. Think about like a better than Dallas Goedert value for most of his career. Not a guy that's going to lead your team, more of a guy that you're sort of happy to have. I will say that one caveat is tight ends don't always develop right out the gate. There's been plenty of tight ends. We talk about guys like Evan Ingram, talk about guys like David Njoku, who maybe flash as a young player, then sort of disappoint us and then settle into a role. Kincaid does have that first-round draft capital, and he gave us a bunch of viable games last year, which is sort of the most frustrating thing about Kincaid is we saw that stretch last year where he was giving us consistent double-digit PPR scoring. It just hasn't happened. Maybe he's going to be a better player next year when there's more viable targets in Buffalo. Like, you got to think they draft somebody. Keon Coleman's going to be a year older. Maybe Amari Cooper resigns, and Khalil Shakir takes a step forward, and they just sort of settle in, and Kincaid sort of has consistency. But yeah, the dream of him being Travis Kelce 2.0, it's over.
Okay, I lied. There's one more chat because I just love Will today. Tell Dan I'm only a fantasy football player since 2000. I was drafting and scouting players when he was still using training wheels. 100% sending this comment to Dan as soon as we finish the show. Theo, awesome stuff as always. Remind everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find most of my content over at Player Profiler, including a number of podcasts. Dynasty Life is my Dynasty podcast over there. I am also writing a Dynasty article for Fantasy Points. That drops every Wednesday or Thursday, and that is not paywalled this year. They're keeping that article free. Some very cool Dynasty stuff over at Fantasy Points as well. And then the School of Scott podcast with Scott Barrett. We drop that every single week. Really has been a fun show this year. Highly recommend you check it out.
He's Theo Gremminger. I'm Heath Cummings. Thank you to Nada. Thank you to everybody who was active in the chat, who watched on Twitter. We will talk to you next Tuesday.